I don't want her. I never did. I heard those words through the heavy oak door of his private chambers. Not whispered. He didn't even have the decency to lower his voice. 3 years I'd scrubbed blood from marble floors, served wine to creatures who could kill me with a thought, survived in a court that saw me as less than human. And the vampire king who held my contract, who owned every breath I took, didn't want me there. The thing is, I'd already known. You always know when you're unwanted. But hearing the flat certainty in his voice as he spoke to his council, that changed something in me. Something that couldn't be changed back. If you've ever felt invisible to someone who should have seen you, if you know what it's like to be dismissed before you've even had a chance to speak, maybe you'll understand why I stayed. Why I didn't run when I finally had the chance. I hope you stay if you want to know what happens when a woman decides she'd rather prove herself than beg to be wanted, and I really hope that by the end, you'll bless me with a subscribe and liking so my story gets pushed further and further to more women like me out there. My father sold me to pay a debt he'd accumulated gambling on vampire run fights in Omaha. $300,000 he didn't have. 3 years of servitude in exchange for his life. The vampire king, Cornelius Sigan, had accepted the terms with a cold efficiency of someone signing a business contract. I was 26 when I entered his court. Not some naive girl, but a woman who'd already survived my father's addictions, my mother's early death, the foreclosure of our farm outside Lincoln. I thought I understood survival. But I didn't understand what it meant to be alive in a place where everything else was beautiful, eternal, and dead. Where the only mortality in gilded halls was mine. Where the creature who ruled with absolute power looked at me like I was already a ghost. The November cold in Omaha had nothing on the chill inside Cornelius Sigan's throne room that morning. I stood just beyond the arched doorway, my arms full of fresh linens that needed pressing, listening to voices drift from the chamber where my fate had been sealed 3 years ago. I hadn't meant to stop. I'd been on my way to the servants' wing, trying to make myself invisible the way I'd learned to do in this palace of eternal faces and centuries-old grudges. But when I heard his voice, that low rasp that could command armies or end lives with equal indifference, I froze. Then why keep her, my lord? That was Theron Ashwood, his closest advisor, a vampire whose age I couldn't even guess. His voice carried through the door with that peculiar clarity vampire voices had, like they were designed to be overheard. The contract expired the moment her father passed. You could have released her.
Could have.
Those 2 words contained universes. I pressed my back against the stone wall. The linens clutched against me like armor that couldn't possibly protect me from what I was hearing. The weight of 3 years. 3 years of bowing my head to creatures who looked at me like I was already dead, of surviving in a court that measured my worth and how well I disappeared, suddenly felt unbearable. The girl is efficient, Cornelius said, and something in his tone made my throat tight. Not affection. Not even warmth. Just the flat assessment you'd give a particularly useful tool. She knows the court. She doesn't make mistakes. Finding someone else to replace her would be inconvenient. Inconvenient. My father had died 3 weeks ago in a charity hospital in Lincoln, his liver finally giving out after years of drowning it in whatever he could afford. I'd been allowed to attend the funeral, 2 hours, supervised, like I was a prisoner on day release. I'd stood at his grave and felt nothing but the ghost of old grief, the kind that had already hollowed me out years before. When I returned to the palace, I'd expected what? Freedom? A pat on the head and dismissal? Some acknowledgement that my 3 years of servitude in exchange for his $300,000 gambling debt had been fulfilled? Instead, Cornelius had called me to his study and offered me a paid position. Not as a servant, but as something more. A staff member with a salary, a room of my own, freedom to leave the palace grounds during daylight hours. I'd been so stunned I'd almost said yes out of reflex. But I hadn't. I'd asked for time to think about it. And he'd given me a week, which expired tomorrow. There are others who could serve. Another voice interjected. Ravenna Thornhart. I recognized her tone. Silk over steel. She was ancient, beautiful, and predatory in ways that made the rest of the court seem almost human by comparison. Mortals are interchangeable, are they not? One learned to bow and scrape as well as another. Not like this one. Cornelius's words came with an edge I'd never heard before. She has a mind. She observes. She anticipates needs before they're spoken. That's rare in anyone, mortal or otherwise. I could picture him perfectly, even though I couldn't see him. 437 years old, though he didn't look a day over 35. The kind of beautiful that made you forget to breathe until your lungs burned with the reminder that you were mortal, and he was not. Dark hair that fell just past his collar. Eyes the color of a winter sky before a storm. A face carved from contradictions, sharp cheekbones, and a mouth that suggested cruelty, but hands I'd watched move with unexpected gentleness when he thought no one was looking. "How pragmatic of you, my lord," Ravanna said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Some might mistake such praise for fondness. Then some would be fools. The dismissal in his voice shouldn't have hurt. I'd spent 26 years learning not to expect anything from people who saw me as a means to an end. My father had sold me to pay his debts. My mother had died when I was 19, worn down by years of trying to hold together a family built on addiction and broken promises. The farm outside Lincoln had been foreclosed before her body was cold. I'd learned survival meant making yourself useful. Indispensable, if you could manage it. It meant swallowing your pride and your anger and your grief until you couldn't remember what it felt like to want something for yourself. But hearing Cornelius reduce me to a collection of efficient habits, hearing him weigh my value against the inconvenience of training someone new, that cracked something I didn't know was still intact. "The blood moon ceremony is in 6 months, Theron said carefully. "The other families will expect you to have chosen by then. Ravanna has been patient, but I'm aware of what's expected," Cornelius cut in. "I'll handle it." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I walked away as quietly as I'd arrived, the linen still clutched against my chest, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape the cage I'd locked it in years ago. The servants' wing was blessedly empty at this hour. Most were preparing for the evening meal service, laying out crystal and polishing silver for creatures who didn't eat food but maintained the rituals anyway. Because immortality, without ceremony, was just endless waiting, I supposed. The linen room was my sanctuary. Small, windowless, smelling of lavender and starch. I set down my burden with shaking hands and braced myself against the wooden sorting table. I don't want her. I never did. Knowing and hearing are different things. Knowing is abstract, a truth you can keep at a comfortable distance. Hearing makes it real. Makes it impossible to pretend that maybe, just maybe, you'd misunderstood. My phone, a contraband device I kept hidden because even paid staff weren't supposed to have connections to the outside world, buzzed in my apron pocket. I pulled it out with trembling fingers. "Joelle, did you decide yet? Please tell me you're leaving that place."
Joelle.
My cousin, the only family I had left who still spoke to me. She worked at a diner in Grand Island, barely making rent, but she'd offered to let me stay with her until I found my feet. She'd been offering for 3 years. I stared at her message, my thumbs hovering over the keyboard. What could I say? That I'd just overheard the vampire king, who owned my contract, dismiss me as a useful convenience? That he was keeping me not because he saw me, not because I mattered, but because training a replacement would be inconvenient? I typed slowly. "I'm thinking about it." Her response came immediately. "There's nothing to think about. You're free now.
Come home. Home."
The word felt foreign. But then another thought surfaced, cold and sharp and unforgiving. He doesn't want me.
Fine.
But he needs me. He said it himself. I'm efficient, observant, irreplaceable. He just doesn't realize how irreplaceable yet. I deleted my message to Joelle and typed something else. I need another week. There's something I have to do first. Because if Cornelius Sigan thought he could keep me like a well-trained hound, useful but ultimately beneath his notice, if he thought I'd be grateful for scraps of consideration while he planned his future with someone like Ravanna Thornhart, he was about to learn something about the woman he'd dismissed. I'd spent 3 years making myself invisible. Maybe it was time to make myself impossible to ignore. Not because I wanted his affection, I'd buried that kind of hope years ago, along with my mother's wedding ring and my father's last apology. But because I decided something standing in that cold linen room, my hands still shaking and my pride still bleeding, if I was going to stay in this palace of beautiful monsters, I was going to do it on my terms. I was going to make Cornelius Sigan realize that the woman he never wanted was the one thing he couldn't survive without. And then I was going to watch him reckon with that. Tomorrow, when he asked for my decision, I would tell him yes. I would take the position he offered. I would smile and bow and thank him for his generosity. And then I would begin. 6 months. That's how long it took for Cornelius Sigan to realize I existed as something more than an efficient pair of hands. 6 months of calculated moves, of positioning myself where I'd be noticed without seeming to want notice. 6 months of studying the court the way my mother once studied weather patterns, watching for shifts in pressure, for the warning signs that preceded storms. I'd learned the rhythms of vampire politics. Who aligned with whom? Who nursed old grudges? Who was ambitious enough to be dangerous and foolish enough to be predictable? And I'd learned that information, carefully deployed, was worth more than any show of strength. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday evening in April. I'd been sorting through the king's correspondence, a task I'd quietly assumed after his previous secretary proved too intimidated by the sender's names to prioritize properly. Most of it was tedious. Petitions from lesser vampires, trade negotiations between territories, invitations to ceremonies I knew Cornelius would decline. But this one made my hands still the moment I broke the seal. It was from Gideon Ravenska, a vampire lord from the Iron Court in Detroit. The language was formal, respectful even. But buried in the flowery pleasantries was a threat so subtle I almost missed it, a reference to concerns about the king's judgment and questions raised by certain families regarding Cornelius's recent distractions. They were calling him weak,
Distracted.
unfit to rule. And they'd sent this letter to arrive during the Blood Court Assembly, when every vampire lord in the region would be watching for signs of vulnerability. I stood in his empty study, the letter in my hands, and made a choice. I burned it. Then I drafted a response in Cornelius's name. I'd spent months studying his handwriting, the particular cadence of his threats, and had it dispatched before dawn. The message was simple. Gideon was welcome to voice his concerns in person at the assembly. Cornelius would be delighted to address them publicly. It was a gamble. If Cornelius discovered what I'd done, I could claim I was protecting his interests. If Gideon accepted the challenge, I'd be responsible for whatever bloodshed followed. But I'd watched Gideon at the winter gathering. He was a coward who hid behind insinuation. He wouldn't come. And I was right. 3 days later, a formal apology arrived. Gideon claimed misunderstanding and miscommunication. The veiled threats disappeared. The challenge dissolved. Cornelius found me in the library that evening. I'd been cataloging recent shipment records, making myself useful in ways that never required me to be in the same room as him. But he sought me out, the letter from Gideon in his hand. "You did this." It wasn't a question. I looked up from my work, kept my expression neutral. "I did what needed doing, my lord." The letter was inappropriate. "You have more important concerns than addressing every insecure fool who mistakes cruelty for strength." Something shifted in his face. For the first time since I'd entered a service, he looked at me like I was something other than a particularly well-trained ghost. "You read my private correspondence. You asked me to sort it. I sorted it." I held his gaze, refused to look away first. "If you prefer someone who passes along threats without assessing their validity, I'm sure the servants' quarters are full of candidates." A long silence stretched between us. I could hear my own heartbeat, too loud, too fast. This was the moment where he'd dismiss me, where my gamble would cost me everything. Then he smiled. Actually smiled. It transformed his face from something carved from ice to something almost human. "Theron said you were clever." I didn't believe him. Theron gives me too much credit. I returned to my work, even as my hands trembled. "I simply have the advantage of being underestimated." "An advantage you've weaponized quite effectively." He set the letter on my desk. Consider yourself promoted. Junior advisor. You'll take chambers in the East Wing. Report to Theron in the morning. He'll brief you on what that entails. He left before I could respond, before I could process what had just happened. I sat in the empty library, staring at the letter that had changed everything, and felt something dangerous bloom in my chest. Not triumph. Something softer, more treacherous.
Hope.
The court noticed, of course. Vampires noticed everything, cataloged every shift in power with the attention of predators tracking wounded prey. Within days, the whispers started. The mortal. The king's pet. How desperate must he be to elevate livestock? I bore it with the same silence I'd perfected over 3 years. Let them whisper. Let them underestimate. I'd learned that contempt was a shield. As long as they dismissed me, they didn't see me as a threat. But Cornelius saw me now. Our conversations began simply enough. He'd summon me to his study, ask my opinion on some political matter, test whether my success with Gideon had been luck or skill. I'd answer honestly, sometimes agreeing with him, often not. He seemed to prefer it when I disagreed, seemed almost bored by agreement, like he'd spent centuries surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. "You think I'm wrong," he said one evening, after I'd quietly dismantled his plan to eliminate a rival through force. "I think you're not considering the cost." I kept my voice even, professional. Yes, you could destroy him, but his family would fracture, and those fragments would scatter to other courts. You'd create a dozen smaller problems instead of solving one large one. And your solution? Make him your ally. Give him something to lose by betraying you. It's harder to hate someone you're bound to by mutual interest. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. That's remarkably cynical. It's remarkably practical. I met his gaze. You didn't survive 400 years by trusting people. Neither did I, by believing in loyalty that hasn't been earned. Something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or surprise that I'd dare speak to him like an equal. Then that almost smile again, the one that made him look less like a king and more like a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be challenged. "Theron was right about you," he said quietly. "You're wasted as an advisor." I didn't ask what he meant, didn't want to know. But I thought about it later, alone in my new chambers in the East Wing. Thought about the way his voice had softened on those last words, like he was admitting something he hadn't meant to say aloud. Theron found me 3 days later, standing in the corridor outside the council chamber. The spring rain hammered against the windows, turning the world beyond into gray watercolor. "Walk with me," he said, and it wasn't a request. We walked in silence until we reached the gardens, the only place in the palace where conversations weren't overheard by too many ears. "Be careful," Theron said finally, his voice low. "The king doesn't understand what he feels. And when he does, he'll resist it with everything he has." My blood went cold. "I don't know what you—" "Yes, you do." His ancient eyes held mine, kind and terrible in equal measure. "You're not the first mortal to catch his attention. But you're the first he's looked at like you might be essential." The word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything I'd convinced myself was strategy, was survival, was anything other than the dangerous truth. I was in far deeper than I'd intended. That night, the blood court assembled for the spring gathering. I stood at the edge of the great hall, watching Cornelius hold court among creatures who'd ruled continents before my country existed. He moved among them with the casual grace of absolute power, every gesture precise, every word calculated. And then, for just a moment, his eyes found mine across the crowded room. The look that passed between us lasted no more than a heartbeat. But in that heartbeat, I saw something that terrified me more than any of his threats ever could. Recognition. Not of what I could do for him, but of what I was doing to him. He looked away first this time. But I knew with bone-deep certainty that nothing between us would ever be simple again. And God help me, I didn't want it to be. The blood moon ceremony happened once a year, when the autumn sky turned the color of old wounds and every vampire in the region gathered to renew their oaths of loyalty. I'd been dreading it for weeks. Not because of the ceremony itself. I'd learned to fade into the background during these displays of ancient power, but because Gideon Ravenska would be there. The same Gideon whose threat I'd burned 6 months ago. The same Gideon who'd sent his formal apology but whose eyes, when they found mine at the spring gathering, promised that he hadn't forgotten. I should have trusted that look. Should have understood that men like him, creatures like him, didn't forgive being made to look weak. The attack came during the oath-taking, when every vampire in the Great Hall was focused on Cornelius. The chandeliers exploded first, raining crystal like frozen rain. Then the doors burst open and Gideon's people poured in, maybe 20 of them, moving with that inhuman speed that turned violence into art. The hall erupted into chaos. Vampires fighting vampires, the sound of it like nothing I'd ever heard. Screaming, not of pain, but of rage, centuries of it unleashed in seconds. I dropped to the floor, my human reflexes too slow for this kind of battle, and crawled toward the servants' entrance. The one advantage I had in this palace of immortals, I knew every hidden passage, every forgotten door. I knew how to disappear. But as I reached the corridor, I heard Gideon's voice, cutting through the violence, with terrible clarity. "The wine, you fool. Make sure he drinks the wine."
Wine.
Cornelius didn't drink wine. Didn't drink anything at these ceremonies except the ritual cup. The one passed at the end of the oath-taking, the symbolic gesture that bound king to court. Every king drank from it. Every king had to, or the oaths wouldn't hold. I understood in that moment what this was. Not a coup through force. Gideon wasn't strong enough for that. This was assassination. Poison in a cup that Cornelius would be honor-bound to drink. My body moved before my mind caught up. I knew where they'd taken the ritual cup, knew because I'd helped prepare it earlier that day, had filled it with the ceremonial wine myself under Theron's supervision. The preparation chamber was on the east side of the hall, accessible through the servants' passage. I ran. Actually ran. Something I never did in this palace, my footsteps echoing off stone while my heart threatened to break through my ribs. The chamber was empty when I reached it, the door hanging open. The cup sat on the preparation table, looking exactly as I'd left it. Except the wine was darker now, thicker. I grabbed it with shaking hands, and something in me whispered that I should pour it out, should destroy it, should do anything except what I was about to do. But there was no time to prepare a new cup, no time to warn anyone. By the time I reached Cornelius, the ritual would be complete. He'd call for the cup.
He'd drink.
And whatever was in this wine would kill him. I made it back to the Great Hall just as the fighting subsided. Gideon's people were dead or fleeing, but the damage was done. The ceremony had been interrupted, the oaths left unspoken. Cornelius stood at the center of the hall, blood on his hands and murder in his eyes, and I watched him reach for the ritual cup that one of his guards had retrieved. "My lord." My voice cut through the silence. Everyone turned to look at me, this mortal, this nothing, daring to interrupt. I walked forward on legs that barely held me, the poisoned cup clutched against my chest. The cup was compromised. "This is the one prepared under Theron's supervision. The one they wanted you to drink has been altered." Cornelius's eyes locked on mine, and I saw him understand. Saw him realize that if I hadn't been there, if I hadn't known the palace well enough to reach the preparation chamber, if I hadn't moved fast enough. He took the cup from my hands, and our fingers brushed. His were cold. Mine were trembling. "You're certain?" His voice was deadly quiet. "I'm certain." He studied the cup for a long moment, then raised it to his lips. I didn't think. Didn't pause to consider consequences or calculate odds. I just moved, snatching the cup from his hand and drinking it myself before anyone could stop me. The taste was wrong immediately. Bitter, metallic, like drinking liquid rust. My throat closed. My vision blurred. I felt my knees buckle, felt myself falling, and the last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Cornelius's face, transformed by something I'd never seen there before.
Fear.
I woke to whispers and the smell of sage. My body felt like it had been hollowed out and filled with broken glass. Every breath hurt. Every heartbeat was agony. Mortal constitution shouldn't have survived it. 3 days, and still. If she dies, the king will. I forced my eyes open. The room was dark except for candlelight, and it took me a moment to realize I wasn't in my chambers. The bed was too large, the ceiling too ornate. This was, "You're awake." Cornelius's voice came from somewhere to my left. I turned my head slowly because the movement sent pain shooting down my spine, and found him sitting beside the bed. He looked wrong, disheveled. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his hair uncombed. Like he'd been here for days without moving. "How long?" My voice came out as a rasp. "4 days." He leaned forward, and I saw shadows under his eyes that shouldn't have been there. Vampires didn't get tired. Didn't get shadows under their eyes from lack of sleep. The poison was designed for ancient vampires. Theron said it should have killed you in minutes. He can't explain why you survived. Disappointing him must be my specialty. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to cooperate. Cornelius's hand was on my shoulder immediately, holding me still with surprising gentleness. "Don't move. You're still healing." "Where?" "My chambers. I had you brought here after." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "After I dealt with Gideon and his people." Dealt with. The word carried the weight of violence I was grateful I hadn't witnessed. We sat in silence for a moment, his hand still on my shoulder, and I realized he was shaking. This creature who'd lived for centuries, who commanded absolute power, who I'd never seen rattled by anything. He was shaking. "Why?" The word came out broken, raw. "Why would you risk your life for mine?" The question I'd been dreading. The one I had no good answer for, because the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. Because somewhere in the past 6 months, I'd stopped being able to imagine a world without him in it. Because when I saw him reaching for that cup, something in me chose his life over my own without hesitation. Because I was in love with him, and I hadn't meant to be. Because a world with you dead in it, I whispered, each word costing me, would be worse than one where I am. His hand tightened on my shoulder. I watched something break open in his face, some wall he'd maintained for centuries finally cracking under the weight of what I'd just given him. "You're a fool," he said roughly. But he didn't move his hand. Didn't look away. "I know. You could have died. I know that too." Aaliyah. My name in his mouth, the first time he'd ever spoken it. Not girl, or mortal, or the careful distance of Mississippi. Just my name, and it sounded like a confession. Like something he'd been holding back and couldn't anymore. But whatever he was about to say died when Theron entered, followed by 2 other council members. Their faces registered shock at finding their king here, at a mortal's bedside, his hand on her shoulder like he had the right to touch her. Like she mattered. The scandal of it rippled through the court within hours. By evening, I'd been moved again. Not back to my chambers in the East Wing, but to rooms in his personal wing. "For your protection," Theron explained, though we both knew protection wasn't the real reason. They'd seen their king keep vigil over me. They'd seen him touch me with something that looked dangerously like tenderness. And now everyone knew what I'd been trying to deny. I wasn't just his advisor anymore. I was something far more dangerous than that. The nights were the hardest. My new chambers in his personal wing were beautiful in a way that felt like mockery. All silk and dark wood, and windows that overlooked the city lights of Omaha stretching toward the horizon. But beauty didn't fill the silence, and silence was all I had after the sun set and the palace shifted into its true life, when vampires emerged and I became the only warm-blooded thing in corridors that felt like walking through a held breath. Cornelius started coming to me on the 3rd night after I'd recovered enough to leave the bed. He'd knock. Always knocked, like he needed my permission to enter rooms in his own palace, and I'd tell him to come in because what else could I do? He was still my king, even if something between us had shifted into territory neither of us knew how to navigate. That first night, he'd stood in my doorway like a man who'd forgotten why he'd come. "I wanted to make sure you were comfortable," he'd said finally. "That you have everything you need." I'd had everything I needed, and nothing I wanted. But I'd nodded and thanked him, and he'd left, and I'd pressed my hand against the door he'd closed, and tried not to think about how much I wanted him to stay. The second night, he'd brought wine. We'd sat in my chambers until dawn, talking about nothing important, books we'd read, philosophies we didn't believe in, the particular absurdity of vampire politics. He'd made me laugh, and the sound had startled both of us, like we'd forgotten laughter was allowed. By the fourth night, the pretense had worn thin. He'd come to my chambers, and we'd both known he wasn't there to check on my comfort. We'd fallen into a pattern after that. Every night, he'd appear at my door. Some nights we'd talk for hours. Other nights we'd sit in comfortable silence while I read, and he stared out the window at a city he'd watched evolve over centuries. He asked me about my life once, on a night when winter rain hammered against the windows and made the world feel very small. "Your father," he said quietly. "You never speak of him." I set down my book, marked my place carefully. "There's not much to say. He was a drunk and a gambler who sold his daughter to pay his debts. I mourned him years before he died. But you attended his funeral. Because even people who hurt us deserve to be buried by someone who remembers they were human once." I met his eyes across the low table between us. Love isn't always about whether someone deserves it. Sometimes it's just about the fact that you can't seem to stop, even when you should. Something flickered across his face, recognition maybe.
Or pain.
"Your mother," he asked, "died trying to hold together something that was already broken. She taught me that sacrifice doesn't make people grateful. It just makes them comfortable with taking." I paused, then asked the question that had been haunting me. "Is that what I am to you? Comfortable sacrifice?"
No.
The word came hard, immediate. "You're the most uncomfortable thing that's happened to me in 4 centuries. I didn't know what to do with that truth, so I filed it away with all the other truths we were collecting but not examining. He told me about his age that night. 437 years of existence, and he made it sound like a prison sentence he couldn't escape. "You think immortality is a gift," he said, staring into his wine. "But it's just time. Endless, meaningless time. Everyone you care about dies. Every city you love crumbles. After a while, you stop caring, because caring is just another way to ensure your own suffering." That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. It's the truth. Those aren't mutually exclusive. I leaned forward, something in me aching for this creature who'd lived so long he'd forgotten how to want anything. "You're not numb, Cornelius. You're just scared. There's a difference." His eyes met mine, and the look in them was devastating. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I?" I held his gaze. "I've watched people I love destroy themselves. I've survived being sold, being owned, being treated like I don't matter. And you know what I learned? That the opposite of love isn't hate. It's the decision to stop feeling anything at all. That's what you've done. You've decided 400 years of loneliness is safer than risking another loss. And what would you have me risk?" His voice was low, dangerous. "What would you have me feel?" "Everything." I wanted to say it. Wanted to reach across the space between us and make him understand that his careful distance was killing something in both of us. But I said nothing, and the moment passed, and we went back to our careful dance of proximity, without contact. The touches started small. His hand on my shoulder when he passed behind my chair. My fingers brushing his when I handed him documents. Nothing that couldn't be explained as accident, as the natural consequence of 2 people existing in the same space. But they lingered. God, they lingered. And every time his skin met mine, I felt something like electricity, like my body was trying to tell me something my mind refused to hear. The court noticed, of course. The whispers grew louder, meaner. "The mortal thinks she's special. The king's new pet. How long until he grows bored and drains her?" I bore it the way I'd learned to bear everything, with silence and a carefully blank expression.
But it wore on me.
Some days I felt like I was balancing on a knife's edge, trying to be close enough to Cornelius to matter, but distant enough to survive. Theron found me in the library 2 months after I'd nearly died. I'd been researching vampire history, trying to understand the world I'd become part of, the rules that govern these creatures who'd taken ownership of my fate. "You're looking in the wrong section," he said, settling into the chair across from me. I didn't realize there was a right section. There isn't. Not for what you need to know. He studied me with those ancient eyes, and I saw pity there. Pity and something that looked like resignation.
Tell me, Aaliyah.
Have you been sleeping well? No one sleeps well in a palace full of vampires. Have you noticed anything unusual? About yourself? I thought about the darkness that didn't feel quite as dark anymore. The cut on my hand that had healed overnight. The way I could sometimes sense Cornelius approaching before I heard his footsteps. What's happening to me? What's been happening since the moment you entered this court? Theron leaned forward. Vampires have fated mates. It's rare. Most go their entire existence without finding one. But when they do, the bond forms whether they want it or not. And when a vampire denies that bond... He paused. Both parties are marked for destruction. The vampire loses their power. The mortal loses their humanity. The words landed like stones in my chest.
No.
I'm sorry. Cornelius would have told me. Cornelius doesn't know. Or he's convinced himself he doesn't. Theron's expression was infinitely sad. He's been resisting this bond for months, and it's killing him. His power flickers. He's aging in ways ancients don't age. And you're changing. Becoming something between mortal and not. The curse is trying to correct what he's denying. I stood, my chair scraping against stone. I need to talk to him. Be careful. The king doesn't understand what he feels. And when he does, he'll resist it with everything he has. You already told me that. I was at the door when Theron spoke again. He will hurt you, Aaliyah. Not because he wants to, but because he's more afraid of needing you than he is of losing you. I found Cornelius in his study, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence he wasn't reading. He looked up when I entered, and I saw it immediately. The exhaustion he tried to hide, the way his hand trembled slightly as he set down his pen. Am I your mate? The question came out harder than I'd intended. The truth, Cornelius. Am I? The silence stretched so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, yes.
Just that.
Just yes. Like he was admitting to something terminal. And you weren't going to tell me. What difference would it make? He stood, and I saw how much the movement cost him. The bond doesn't change anything. It changes everything. It changes nothing. His voice rose for the first time since I'd known him. I won't bind myself to anyone. I won't spend eternity watching you realize what a mistake you've made, what a prison you've chosen. I won't. He stopped, his control fracturing. It doesn't matter what you are. I won't do that to you. You don't get to make that choice for me. I'm making it anyway. He turned away, presenting me with his back. This conversation is over. I left his study with tears burning behind my eyes and my heart shattering into pieces I didn't know how to gather. Because I understood then what Theron had tried to warn me about. Cornelius would rather die than admit he needed me. And I would rather fade into nothing than watch him destroy himself. We'd both made our choices. And we were both going to suffer for them. She arrived on a Tuesday in February, when the Nebraska cold had turned brutal and the palace felt like a tomb carved from ice. Ravenna Thornheart. Even her name sounded like something from a darker age, when vampires didn't pretend to coexist with humans but ruled them openly. I heard the commotion from my chambers, the sudden flurry of activity, the whispers racing through corridors like wildfire. By the time I made it to the Great Hall, half the court was already assembled, watching her entrance with something that looked like reverence. She was beautiful in a way that made you understand why ancient cultures built temples to cruel gods. Tall, with hair the color of mahogany and eyes that had witnessed the fall of empires. She moved through the court like she owned it, and maybe she did. Maybe she'd owned it centuries before I was born, when Cornelius was young enough to believe in binding himself to someone. "My lord," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the hall. "It's been too long." Cornelius stood from his throne, and I watched something I'd never seen before cross his face. Not happiness, exactly, but recognition. The kind that comes from shared history, from knowing someone when the world was different. Ravenna. He descended the steps, took her offered hand, kissed it with a formality that felt intimate anyway. 300 years. I'd begun to think you were dead. You should know by now that I'm very hard to kill. Her smile was predatory. I've come to collect on an old promise, if you'll still have me. The court erupted into barely contained excitement. I stood at the back of the hall, my heart turning to stone in my chest, and understood what was happening. This wasn't a visit. This was a claiming. Theron found me an hour later, standing in the corridor outside my chambers. I hadn't been able to make myself go inside, couldn't face the four walls that suddenly felt like a cell. You need to understand, he said quietly. Ravenna was promised the position of Queen 3 centuries ago. They were betrothed before she disappeared. In our world, such promises carry weight. I'm not asking for an explanation. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow, distant. I understand perfectly. Do you? His ancient eyes searched my face. Because the king is about to make a terrible mistake, and I don't think you understand what that means for you. It means I leave. I pack my things and I go back to whatever life I can salvage. It means I was a fool to think. I stopped, couldn't finish. Couldn't admit aloud what I'd been foolish enough to hope for. It means more than that, Theron said gently. But you're not ready to hear it yet. He was wrong. I was ready. I'd been ready since the moment I overheard Cornelius say he didn't want me. I'd just been stupid enough to forget that lesson somewhere along the way. Ravenna found me in the library that evening. I'd been gathering my books, the ones I'd collected over months of trying to understand this world I'd never truly belonged to. She watched me from the doorway for a long moment before speaking. So you're the mortal. She said it like she was identifying an insect. The one who's been keeping my betrothed occupied. I'm the king's advisor. Nothing more. The lie tasted like ash. Of course you are. She moved into the room with that predatory grace. Tell me, do you actually believe he cares for you? Or have you simply convinced yourself that usefulness is the same as being wanted? The words hit their mark because they were true. Because I'd spent my whole life confusing necessity with value, making myself indispensable to people who would discard me the moment something better came along. I don't know what you... Please. Ravenna laughed, and the sound was crystalline, cruel. I've lived 700 years. I've seen 1,000 women like you convince themselves they're special, that they're different, that somehow their humanity makes them more interesting to our kind. You're not even a footnote in his history. You're a distraction he'll forget the moment I remind him what real eternity looks like. She left me standing there, surrounded by books that suddenly meant nothing, and I realized she was right. What was I to someone who'd lived centuries? What was my brief mortal span compared to an eternity with someone who understood his world, his power, his endless burden of years? I started packing that night. 1 bag, then 2. Everything I'd accumulated in my time here. Books, clothes that were too fine for whatever life waited outside these walls. I worked methodically, fighting the tears that kept threatening, refusing to let myself break until I was somewhere safe. The letter took longer. I wrote it and rewrote it, trying to find words that would release us both from whatever this had been. Finally, I settled on simplicity. Thank you for extending my contract beyond its terms. I've learned much in your service. But it's time I built a life that belongs to me. I release you from any obligation you might feel. I hope you find happiness with someone worthy of eternity. Aaliyah. I sealed it, left it on my desk where he'd find it, and made it as far as the palace gates before Theron intercepted me. Don't. His voice was urgent. Don't leave. Not yet. There's nothing left for me here. There's everything left for you here. You just can't see it yet. He gripped my shoulders, and I saw something like desperation in his ancient face. The king is making a mistake. He thinks he's protecting you by choosing Ravenna. He doesn't understand. Understand what? The words came out broken. That I'm dying a little more each day watching him choose someone else? That every time he looks through me instead of at me, something in me just stops? I understand perfectly, Theron. I understand that I'm not enough. That I was never going to be enough. That's not... He stopped, seemed to come to some decision. There's something you need to know about the curse. Something I didn't tell you before. The temperature dropped. Or maybe it was just my blood running cold. If Cornelius bonds with the wrong person, Theron said carefully, if he tries to force a bond with someone who isn't his fated mate, the curse won't just kill him. It will erase you.
Completely.
Every memory of you, every impact you've made, every moment you existed, gone. You won't die, Aaliyah. You'll be unmade, as if you never were. The bag slipped from my fingers. No. The curse is trying to correct his denial. If he binds himself to Ravenna, it will see you as the obstacle, the thing preventing the true bond from forming. And it will remove you. He wouldn't, but I couldn't finish. Because Cornelius didn't know. He was trying to save me by pushing me away, and he had no idea he was condemning me to something worse than death. You need to tell him, I whispered. He won't listen to me. He barely listens to reason anymore. The curse has weakened him, made him desperate. He thinks binding with Ravenna will break it, will save you both. Theron's grip tightened. But it will only destroy you. I stood at those gates for a long time after Theron left. The winter wind cut through my coat, and in the distance, I could see the lights of Omaha, the world I'd come from, the life I'd tried to build before my father's debts had sold me into this beautiful nightmare. I could leave. I could walk through those gates and maybe, just maybe, the curse would release me. Maybe I'd survive long enough to die on my own terms instead of being erased like a mistake. Or I could go back inside. I could fight for a man who'd made it clear he didn't want to be fought for. I could try to convince him that saving me by destroying us both wasn't salvation, it was surrender. The gates stood open. Freedom waited on the other side. But when I picked up my bag and turned around, I found myself walking back toward the palace. Back toward the man who was going to erase me, trying to save me. Because even knowing the cost, even understanding what it would mean, I couldn't leave him to make this mistake alone. Some loves don't set you free. Some loves just teach you that freedom was never what you wanted in the first place. Even if choosing him meant choosing my own destruction. Even if the price of loving Cornelius Sigan was becoming nothing at all. The bonding ceremony was scheduled for the first night of March, when the last of winter still clung to the air and the entire vampire world descended on Omaha to witness what they thought would be a restoration of order. Cornelius Sigan, finally choosing someone appropriate. Someone eternal. Someone who wouldn't die and leave him diminished by grief. I dressed carefully that night, in a gown the color of dried blood that one of the servants had left in my chambers. I didn't know who'd sent it. Theron, maybe, or some sympathetic soul who understood that even witnesses to your own erasure deserved to look dignified. My hands shook as I fastened the clasp at my neck, and in the mirror, I could see it beginning. The fading. My reflection was slightly translucent around the edges, like I was already becoming a ghost. The great hall had been transformed into something from an older, darker age. Candles everywhere, their flames casting shadows that moved like living things. The assembled vampires filled every space, centuries of power concentrated in one room, all of them waiting to watch their king bind himself to someone worthy of eternity. I stood at the very back, pressed against the wall, trying to make myself smaller than I already was. Trying to disappear before the curse did it for me. Cornelius entered first, dressed in black that made him look like he was attending a funeral instead of a wedding. His face was carved from stone, revealing nothing. But I knew him well enough by now to see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He looked like a man walking toward his own execution. Then Ravenna appeared, magnificent in silver that caught the candlelight and threw it back like armor. She moved down the aisle with the confidence of someone who never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she deserved to be seen. The ancient words began. I didn't understand the language, something older than Latin, older than any tongue still spoken by humans. But I felt the weight of them, the magic they carried. Felt the way they pressed against my chest like a physical thing, demanding acknowledgement. Halfway through the ceremony, the air in the hall shifted. Went wrong, somehow. The candles flickered, and I felt something crack. Not in the room, but in reality itself. Like the world was rejecting what was happening, trying to correct a mistake that shouldn't be allowed to continue. Cornelius stumbled. Actually stumbled. This creature who'd never shown weakness, who moved with the certainty of centuries. His hand went to his chest, and I saw his face contort with pain. The palace began to shake. It started small, just a tremor, easily dismissed. But it built, became something violent, and vampires who'd stood still for hundreds of years began looking around with something that might have been fear. And I felt it too. Felt myself beginning to fade in earnest now, my edges blurring, my substance thinning. I looked down at my hands and could see through them to the wall behind me. Could feel myself being unmade, erased, like the universe was deleting a file that had corrupted the system. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice was already gone. I was disappearing too fast, and no one was looking at me anyway. They were all watching Cornelius, watching him fall to his knees as his power shattered around him, watching 4 centuries of accumulated strength drain away like water through broken hands. Then his eyes found mine across the crowded hall. Even fading, even barely there, he saw me. And I watched understanding crash through him like a physical blow, watched him realize what the curse had been trying to tell him all along. That Ravenna wasn't the answer. That denying what he felt wasn't protection. That I was never the problem. I was always the solution. Stop. His voice cut through the chaos, through the shaking palace and the panicked vampires and the ancient magic that was trying to erase me.
Stop this.
All of it.
Now.
The officiant froze, the words dying on his lips. Ravenna turned to Cornelius with fury and disbelief warring on her perfect face. "What are you doing?" she demanded. But Cornelius wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me, this half-transparent ghost at the back of the hall, and he was moving toward me with the desperation of a man who'd finally understood what he was about to lose.
Aaliyah.
My name was a prayer, a confession, an apology all at once. He pushed through the crowd, vampires scattering before him, and when he reached me, his hands passed through my shoulders before finding purchase.
No.
No, you don't get to fade. You don't get to leave me because I was too much of a coward to. It's too late, I whispered, and my voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. The curse. The curse can be reversed. Theron was suddenly there, his ancient face illuminated by candlelight and certainty. Speak the words, my lord. Claim her as your mate. Do it now, before she's gone completely. Cornelius turned back to me, and his hands cupped my face, or tried to, his fingers sinking into my fading cheeks like I was made of smoke. And I saw tears on his face, actual tears. This creature, who'd convinced himself he couldn't feel any more, crying for a mortal he'd tried so hard not to want.
Aaliyah.
He said my name with power this time, with magic I didn't understand but could feel singing through my dissolving bones. Not servant, not advisor, not convenient or useful, or any of the ways I tried to diminish what you are.
Mine.
My equal. My mate. My queen. The words hit me like lightning, like being struck by something ancient and terrible and true. The curse reversed so violently I gasped, my substance snapping back into reality, so fast it hurt. I could feel myself becoming solid again, becoming real, but I could also feel something else, something changing at a fundamental level. The magic manifested then, visible to everyone in the hall. It looked like light and shadow braided together, like something that had been waiting centuries for this moment. And it spoke, not with words but with understanding that crashed through my mind. Accept and transform. Become what you were always meant to be. Bind yourself to him, immortal and eternal. Or refuse. Remain human. Remain mortal. And lose him forever. The choice hung in the air between us. I could see it in Cornelius's eyes. The fear that I'd refuse, that I'd choose my humanity over him, that I'd decide the price of loving him was too high. And maybe it was. Maybe I should have chosen myself, chosen the brief, finite life I'd been born to, chosen freedom over an eternity with a man who'd spent months trying not to want me. But I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what Theron had seen all along.
Not a king who didn't want me,
A man who wanted me so much it terrified him. Who tried to save me by pushing me away because he didn't understand that sometimes salvation looks like surrender. You didn't want me, I said, my voice stronger now, solid again.
But you needed me.
You still don't know the difference, do you? I looked past him at the assembled court, at Ravana's face, twisted with rage, at Theron's hope, at hundreds of vampires who'd witnessed me nearly fade from existence. I choose this, I said clearly. Not because I'm surrendering to fate. Not because I don't have other options. But because I'm deciding that my destiny is mine to forge. I turned back to Cornelius, held his gaze. You're going to spend eternity learning that a queen isn't someone who submits. She's someone who claims what's hers. I took his hand, solid and real, and choosing him despite everything. The transformation was agony. My body rewriting itself at a cellular level, mortality burning away to make room for something else. I felt my heart slow, felt my breath become optional instead of necessary, felt time shift from a river I was drowning into an ocean I could finally swim through. But through it all, Cornelius held me. Held me like I was the only thing anchoring him to reality, like letting go would mean losing himself. When it finished, when I stood before him immortal and changed and somehow still myself, he pulled me close and whispered against my hair, I didn't deserve you. No, I agreed, my new voice carrying power I didn't quite understand yet. But you have me anyway.
Try to be worthy of it.
The court erupted into chaos. Some shouting, some fleeing, Ravana's screams of betrayal cutting through it all. But Theron was already moving, already organizing, already managing the fallout of what we'd done. And in the center of it all, Cornelius and I stood together. Two people who'd survived centuries of loneliness and years of invisibility, finally allowing themselves to be seen. They say I'm your destiny, I murmured. You are, he said quietly. But I'm also your doom. Because loving me meant becoming something you never chose. Immortal, I finished. Powerful. Seen. I pulled back enough to meet his eyes. This creature who is mine now, bound to me by magic and choice and the stubborn refusal to let each other go. And there's no going back from that. There are other women like me in this world, in this city where old power still watches from the shadows. Women who were given everything they thought they wanted, only to discover the price was written in fine print. Women who learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let yourself be seen by someone who's forgotten how to look. We don't talk about it, these transformations, but we recognize each other. If you felt something shift in you while listening to this, if you understood why I stayed when I should have run, there are more stories like mine. Moments where women choose the impossible thing because the alternative is a life spent wondering what they were too afraid to become. Don't let them slip away. They're easy to lose if you're not paying attention.